presenters having used their recordings anytime? Or let's put it this way, have any of the demos broken in between?
There were some glitches, but not actually. But now we're live. So let me start.
Presenters having used their recordings anytime? Or let's put it
Vivian, we are already live now. So I would like to start the intro. So, a very warm welcome. Successfully deploying applications on SAP BTP is just the beginning. True value emerges when you can efficiently operate, maintain, and scale them. In this series, we will explore the critical aspects of day two operations to help you gain most out of your applications in SAP BTP. By the end of today's session, you will know how to simplify Terraform adoption for your SAP BTP infrastructure. Thank you for joining our fourth episode of our series, Mastering Day 2 Operations in SAP BTP. Surviving Brownfield Terraform projects with the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP. I have the pleasure of having here with me Vipin Vijay Kumar and Christian Lechner. Again, Vipin is DevOps engineer with focus for platform monitoring on SAP Cloud Platform, leading the development teams for Terraform at SAP, namely for the Terraform provider for SAP BTP and the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP. As a person who loves open source, these projects align with his interests very well. Christian, development architect for the SAP BTP Foundation Technology Office, and one of the core contributors for all things Terraform on SAP BTP. He loves to improve developer experience, which perfectly fits to Terraform as a tool for platform teams to make their developers' lives easier. And with this, Vipin, over to you.
Welcome, everybody, to our day two operations. And the session that we are looking at today is how do you survive Brownfield Terraform projects with Terraform Exporter for SAP BTP. We'll start with a disclaimer, of course, that everything that we are discussing over in this session today is for informational purposes only and could change over time. Right, so talking about what's the agenda that we have, the first thing we'll do is, of course, we will recap on Terraform and the way Terraform could be used with BTP. And then we'll also look at what the challenge is for customers. And then we'll finally look at how the challenge of using the brownfield scenarios could be solved. Moving on to what we are looking at today is this is primarily for architects and developers, and this is primarily for the administration and the operation of sub-accounts and global accounts on BTP, meaning the kind of activities that you as a global account administrator would do on BTP is, and how you would automate them is what's the primary discussion on over here. And yeah, moving on, we'll start with, first of all, basically, what's the goal we have for today? And the first thing that we need to keep in mind is that we are looking at how do we automate the whole idea of administering BTP. And when we talk about that, there are two aspects to it. The first one is provisioning all the infrastructure, and the second thing is about managing your infrastructure, right? And with any organization, there are a certain set of conventions that you have to follow. There is a certain way, maybe the way you have a naming pattern in place, the way you have different kinds of users that are added. All these require an automation in place, and it needs to be done in the most efficient way possible. And another aspect is that all of this requires compliance. There are different rules and aspects that your organization would be following, and this has to be the same for all the different infrastructures that you are managing. Now, there could be different ways of doing it. You would have scripting, you're probably using ClickOps, or you would have certain other tools in place. One of the most common tools that you would go across for that is infrastructure as code. And with infrastructure as code, the idea is that you would write your infrastructure configuration in any specific configuration or a coding aspect, and you would use that approach. Now, one of the most common tools when we talk about infrastructure as code is Terraform, right? The way Terraform works is that you would have a configuration that is written in Terraform's HashiCorp language, and you would basically define what your infrastructure needs to be. For example, you want a sub account. So you would define what your sub account is, maybe the name of the sub account, maybe certain labels, the region where the sub account is. But you do not need to worry about how the sub account is created behind the scene. Terraform takes care of that. Now, the way that happens is you would define in your configuration the various resources that you need, and then you would use a plan whereby Terraform would basically kind of structure how it has to create the different aspects of your sub account. For example, maybe you have a set of entitlements, maybe you have a set of role collections, and you also need a sub account that's created. So Terraform would basically create a plan where it creates a sub account first, and then it would look at what other role collections and the entitlements that needs to be placed. And finally, it's going to apply this and create your actual infrastructure, whatever that is. So Terraform supports different kinds of infrastructures, whether it's your typical AWS, GCP, your BTP providers, all the different kinds of infrastructures. And once it applies all these, what it's going to do is the state that is created of all the infrastructure. Now, all the resources that were created, it has to store the state of that somewhere, right? It's going to store that in something called as a state file. So the state file is you could say, the central source of truth as far as Terraform is concerned about what are all the changes that's happened to your infrastructure. So Terraform keeps track of all those changes using the state file. And the next time you make a change on your Terraform configuration, it's going to compare that against what is on the state file to identify what's the difference and what needs to be changed. Right. So moving on. Now the question can be, why Terraform? Well, the biggest reason is the ecosystem that it has is pretty big. There are more than 3,000 providers in place, and you can mix and match multiple different Terraform providers with each other depending on your use case. And most organizations would be relying on more than infrastructure. They would be beyond that. I mean, beyond the platform, you would be using a lot of things from different aspects of the infrastructure. And when you use Terraform, you could use the providers for these different kinds of infrastructure to co-work with each other. The second aspect is, of course, you are looking at automation. You need a way to automate your BTP resources. And that's where Terraform would fit right in, because as we earlier told, Terraform is one of the most common infrastructure as code and DevOps utility that's used. And then automation of your BTP resources can be done without reinventing the wheel. And the most important aspect finally is governance, right? You need to be having ways to audit what are the changes. With configuration in place, you would basically keep all these configurations in a version controlled manner. You'd probably use Git or GitLabs or something where you would store all this configuration. So you have auditing in place. Every time there is a change, there is a way to track it. So essentially, you now are in a place where you can also start bringing the governance into your BTP as well as non-BTP landscapes in a common fashion. Okay. Now, one important aspect that we need to take care of or keep in mind is that throughout the session that we are talking about today, while we will be saying Terraform primarily, everything that we say applies for OpenTofu as well. So everything that works with Terraform here as of today would work with OpenTofu as well. Yeah. So now the question is, okay, I'd like to move into Terraform. Everything is great, but we have a problem. And that is, how would we bring in, let's think of this situation. You are a BTP administrator and you have been, managing a couple of sub-accounts on BTP. These were probably created through the cockpit, maybe the BTP CLI, maybe you have your own set of scripts that you had written, but they were not managed on Terraform anyway. Now the thing is, okay, the Terraform provider is come in, everything is great. You'd like to move on to your sub-accounts into Terraform. How would you go about that? Now, the aspect is that you also want to be able to make a consistent management of all your Terraform. So basically, you have a bunch of sub-accounts that you created using Terraform, but now you have a set of existing sub-accounts that also needs to be brought in so that you are consistently managing all the sub-accounts using Terraform. This is going to be a challenge because the question is, how would you bring in existing sub-accounts under the management of Terraform? So for people who have already tinkered around and have been working on Terraform, you probably already know where we are going with. Anyhow, to move on to that, I would ask Christian to go ahead and show how we would do that with Vanilla Terraform.
Okay, yeah. So thanks, Vipin, for the introduction and raising this question. Because I would assume every customer is facing exactly this situation, this hybrid scenario kind of. You have parts on BTP that has been created by the cockpit and parts that are now created by Terraform. And you are not the first person or the first company to face this issue. There are a lot of companies out there, and Terraform is a huge ecosystem that already had that challenge, and that's why there is a flow for importing Terraform.
Christian, may I
Yep.
quickly interrupt you? There is a banner
There is a
in
banner.
the screen.
Yeah, I see it. Let me shortly remove that and switch back to the slides. So
Yes.
now it should be good.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as Terraform is, as Vipin mentioned, the de facto industry standard for infrastructure as code, there is, of course, awareness of this situation. And therefore, there is a functionality within the Terraform CLI that allows you to import existing infrastructure into Terraform, which mainly means that you populate this memory of Terraform, this Terraform state file, with the information that is currently just in your platform, namely in the SAP BTP. Now, this flow consists of several steps in order to do that if you're using the Terraform CLI. The first thing that you have to do, of course, is to find out what information is needed in order to import a resource, which is the import key. So the key of the resource that is needed in order to tell Terraform, hey, I want to have this resource imported. Once you know what you need, you have to find out the value of the import key for the resource instance of the platform. So let's say you want to import a sub-account resource, then you have to find out which key is needed, which is the sub-account ID, and then you have to determine the value of the key. That's quite easy for the sub-account. That might be more complicated for other resources that have a combined key. Then you have to write a HashiCorp configuration language artifact that is called import block, which tells Terraform or which instructs Terraform, hey, I want to import a resource that belongs to this import key, and please put it to this address within my Terraform configuration. Once you have done that, there are two options. You either can write the Terraform configuration manually. So how does the resource look like? What attributes are with which values attached to this resource? Or, as an alternative, you can generate the configuration based on the import block. Now, this generation of the configuration is experimental. From our experience, it works really well for SAP BTP, so this is something that you should definitely take a look at. Now, we have those 4 steps. And now think of importing a real-life sub-account, which contains sub-account entitlements, custom role collections, subscriptions, service instances, I don't know what. Now you have to repeat these 4 steps for every resource instance that you want to import. And you have to do that manually. And once you have done that, you can then really execute the state import, so populate the state file and get things going. As you can already think of, that's not that easy to do, and it's quite some work that needs to be done. And we have a sample there which walks you through the way of doing those 4 steps for several resources in our samples repository, which is taking the part of or the path of manually writing the Terraform configuration. What we will do now, in order to give you some impression how that looks and feels like if you have never done an import before, we will now switch to a small setup where we want to import 2 resources. Now, first things first, where do I find the information about the import, the key? Where do I know where that comes from? Well, that's part of the official Terraform documentation within the Terraform registry. So each resource that supports the import operation has a little import block within it. So let's take the subaccount as we said before. And here we have the documentation of the BTP subaccount resource. And now let's scroll down to the very end. And what we will see here is a little section that's called import. So this resource definitely supports the import. And here is some, let's say, older way how you can do that via the Terraform import command. And here we find the key that is needed in order to do the import. And that's a subaccount key. That is easy. Let's also take a look at, for example, an entitlement. So let's import the entitlement. Let's see what we need. Well, for the entitlement, we need a bit more information. We need the subaccount ID. We need the service name, what the entitlement should enable, and of course the plan name. So quite some information to look up in the cockpit via BTP CLI, maybe via data sources of Terraform, and then bring that into Terraform configuration. So let's take a look at how this looks like. And this would be a setup that you probably would have in order to do an import. Now, first things first, of course, you need to define the provider. You need to have a provider block, and you have to configure the provider with a global account value so that Terraform knows which global account to connect to. In the variables, I just have the global account, so nothing to see here. And here within the import.tf file, this is where I put in those import blocks. So this HashiCorp configuration language artifact, where I say, hey, please import me a resource with the ID blah, 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 to a location within the Terraform configuration that is pointing to the resource subaccount and has the address my subaccount. And I do the same for the entitlement. And as we can see here, this is a bit more complex key. It's a combined key having the service name and the service plan name as part of the key. Now, for the sake of the demo, what we will do now is we will now use this generative approach. And as you probably don't want to see me type, I will copy that over. And what we have here now is we have the -generate config out flag that we use in order to generate the resource configuration. Otherwise, we would have to craft that manually. And I will also store the plan. So let's do that. And let's let Terraform do whatever it can do in order to get things going. As you can see, it's now really preparing the import. It's refreshing the state, and it's gathering all the data from the resources that we have based on the information that's available in the provider metadata and that's on the platform. And as a result, we get this generated resources TF file, which contains the generated resource configuration that you would have to craft manually if you don't use that flag. Now, what we immediately see is, well, there is some work done for us, but there are some shortcomings that Terraform cannot know because there are semantics of the platform. So for example, I have here this entitlement and I have here a subaccount. Now, I can only create the entitlement if there is a subaccount, and of course there is the subaccount ID, which is hard-coded here. It's the value that Terraform reads from the platform. So what I would have to do now in a real-life scenario, I would have to replace that by a reference to this resource in order to model the implicit dependency. Now, in addition, I might want to also extract the parent ID as a variable. I might want to extract the region as a variable because that's how I would craft the configuration if I would do it manually. And as you can also see, there is some optional parameter which is not filled for the sub account that I've been using. And that's why it's set to null. Usually I wouldn't put that in the configuration, right? But that's how it is. That's the best what the Terraform CLI can do. Now, what we will do now is really import that. So finish the process by applying the plan. And as you can see, there are now 2 resources imported. And if you have been looking closely now, this terraform.tf state file popped up. So now we have this memory, and if we take a look at the resources that are in the state file via Terraform state list, what we see is I have my sub account and I have my entitlement alert notification service that is imported, and now I can continue to manage this sub account and this entitlement via Terraform. That's it, and well, it's not that easy, I guess you agree. So taking a look at the import via the Terraform CLI, the vanilla functionality of Terraform, what we learned is it is part of the standard functionality, so it's nothing that has to be covered by any third-party tool per se. It works. I mean, we could import the Terraform configuration. We have the state file. We can even generate the resource configuration. It's not nice, but it's okay. But nevertheless, it's still high effort. It's error prone, it's cumbersome because you have to craft all those import blocks. You have to look at your account, you have to find out what's in, you have to find out what keys do I need, and then you have to type down the import blocks, then you have to generate the code, you have to adjust the code, you do the import. If it doesn't work, you have to do further adjustments and so on and so forth. So the barrier to bring your existing sub-accounts to Terraform is a bit high from our perspective, and that's why we thought it might be time to bring something that respects the situation and makes your life easier, which is called the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP. Now, let's take a look what's the idea behind this tool. First of all, the most important point is we want to lower the entry barrier of imports to Terraform for SAP BTP customers. It's possible to bring stuff into the management of Terraform, but it's, from our perspective, not easy or not convenient enough. Let's say it that way. For that, we therefore provide a dedicated CLI that wraps the import of directories, sub-accounts, and Cloud Foundry orgs for you. We do so by enabling 2 different flows, which I will talk about in a minute, in order to enable you to do the import and also to respect some, let's say, variants that you might have within your organization to successfully import and manage your assets. In addition, we are a bit opinionated with that CLI, so we want to stick to good practices. So the CLI does not support the import of a complete global account with 10 sub-accounts and I don't know what. Reason for that is we don't want to bring you in a situation where you end up in a teralith, so in a monolithic state file, where you have everything within one state and changes get super cumbersome and you have issues with planning because it takes ages. So we really restrict it to directories, sub-accounts, and Cloud Foundry orgs to have this splitting, to have good practices with the Terraform configuration that you create. Now, this CLI is not something that you can buy. It's an open source CLI that's available on GitHub. And just yesterday, we released the first release candidate for this exporter, so it's already quite mature. Now, let's take a look what this CLI can do for you. And as I mentioned, there are 2 flows that we support with respect to the import. The first one is using what we call JSON inventory to bring the stuff into Terraform. What you have to do with the CLI is you specify the execution level. So is it a sub-account? Is it a directory? Is it a Cloud Foundry org? And then the CLI creates an inventory of the existing resources in that, let's say, sub-account. The result is a JSON file that you can then check and you can tailor with respect to the content that is exported or imported to Terraform. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you don't want to bring everything under the management of Terraform. That could be an option. Or your organizational setup is set up in a way that you have one team that cares about one part of the sub-account and one part, the development team maybe, that cares about a different part of the sub-account. And you don't want to first export things and then move things around and kind of separate the Terraform configuration. That's something that we want you not to have to do. So that's why you can now tailor the inventory content and then execute the import based on such an inventory file. That's one option. The second option is a direct export. So again, you have to specify the execution level so that the CLI knows what to export. And then you can optionally restrict resources. So let's say you don't want to export, I don't know, app subscriptions or something like that. But that's optional. And then you can directly execute the import, which will give you the Terraform configuration, including all the import files and so on. So at no place here, you have to look up information in the cockpit. You have to find out what keys are needed for the import and so on and so forth. That's all done by the CLI and even a bit more. So why don't we take a look at how things work and walk through the different flows? So let me switch to the setup. So here I have already installed the BTPTF CLI, or the exporter CLI. It's called BTPTF. And if we take a look at the help, it's telling you already what you can do. It also highlights the prerequisites, and we try to keep things as convenient for you as possible. So if you want to take a look at the prerequisites, hey, here's the link to the prerequisites. And here we see the 3 different commands that we have corresponding to the flows that I just discussed. And last but not least, if you find a bug, if you're looking for a feature, head over to GitHub via following this link and open an issue for that. Happy to get your feedback here. So now let's take a look at the flow where we use the inventory. So what we have to do is a BTPTF create JSON. And what do we need here? What do we have here? Okay, so it creates or it can import several resources. That's all listed here. We have several parameters here that allow you to fine tune where you put the configuration information to, what sub-account to use, for example, and so on and so forth. There are several examples for that, but let's directly jump in and do an import of the sub-account, or let's create the JSON inventory for the sub-account that we just did the manual Terraform import. So I do now create a JSON file. I specify the sub-account ID, and the Terraform export CLI now heads over to the sub-account and fetches all the resources that are importable and crafts this JSON file. Now, this takes a bit. So let's quickly jump over to a file that I already prepared to give you an idea how things look like. So basically, we have a JSON file which contains an array of different objects that correspond to the resources that you can import, like a sub-account, entitlements, subscriptions, maybe role collections, service instances, and so on. And for each of these objects, we have an array of values that correspond to the names or combinations of names and plan names or something like that, what makes sense for the corresponding resource, as you can see here. And as you can see now, the file was already created. By default, it's called BTP resources underscore and the ID of the level that we exported. You can tailor that however you want. And as you can see here, there's a bit more now happening, a bit more stuff that it finds and that you can, in principle, export. Now, assuming this is the setup that we want to export. So this tailored file that I've just shown you with those few resources. Let's now let the CLI do the magic. So what we do now is we do a export by JSON. So we tell the BTP TF CLI, hey, I have a JSON file and that's called prep.btp resources.json. And it's pointing to the sub account. So let's go and execute the export. And what happens now is it takes the information from the file, iterates over it, and does all the nitty-gritty detailed stuff around creating import blocks, generating the resources, and as we will see in a second, also a bit of fine-tuning with respect to the code that it generates. On the right-hand side, you might see that there is some popping up and of directories. So the main one that is of interest for us is this generated configurations underscore GUID file. And we have some files that for temporal reasons for the export get created and removed in order to fetch the data and massage it a bit and then bring it to the main configuration. And as you can see here, the directory is growing. We are now at the role collections. And the last thing, if I remember correctly, are the service instances that need to be imported. That's good. Now we are making the Terraform configuration even better, and we will see in a second what that means. And at the end, you get a little overview within the console, what was exported, how many resources have been exported. So it has been 6 resources. Let's shortly check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, cool. At least the number matches. 2 entitlements, that's also correct. And we now have everything within this generated configurations folder. And as you can see, there is quite some work that has been done. Resembles a bit to the stuff that we had within the manual import, right? So let's see, the provider TF, okay, that's something that of course we have to configure. It's configured on our behalf. It's pointing to the latest version, okay? And we have a configuration that's pointing to a variable. Okay, that's nice. Let's take a look at the variables file. And there we see, okay, it's not only the global account, we also have some more variables in here that are defaulted. Okay, looks okay. And then we have a lot of import.tf files. And that are exactly the import files that you would have to craft manually. So this is something that we do via the CLI for the sub account, for the entitlements, role collections, you name it. And as you can see, the keys that are needed, the IDs that are needed to do the import are automatically filled. That's good because that's something that you don't have to do. Now let's take a look at the generated code. And we already see, okay, we reuse the code generation that I've just showed you. But as it was the same sub account that we used before, we already see, this null thingy is no longer there. Those 2 parameters are, well, pointing to a variable. That's also nice. And now more about the details. So I said before, there might be implicit dependencies. So if you have entitlements, if you have a sub account, well, the entitlements belonging to the sub account needed this implicit dependency that we did not see before. Here, looking at the entitlement, we see it's exactly pointing to the resource of the sub account and referencing the ID field so that we have the implicit dependency. So this is much closer to what you would do if you craft things manually. Now, same, of course, for all the other resources. And now we also exported the subscription. Now, when you think about the flow that you would have when you do that manually, what would you do? You would create a sub account, then you would create the entitlement, and then the subscription that you create needs to explicitly depend to the entitlement because the entitlement first has to be done before executing the subscription. Now, we also bring that in by making the Terraform configuration better. And if we find some entitlement that matches the subscription, well, we bring in the explicit depends on stuff. And let's see, entitlement 1 That should be the dashboard feature flags dashboard. Exactly. So that meets the condition. Now, another thing that is worth to mention is service instances. When you think about service instances, what would be the flow if you craft things manually? You do the entitlement, then you have to look up the technical ID of the service plan. And with this technical ID, you can create the service instance. That is a flow that you would typically implement manually. Now, if Terraform would generate the configuration, it just would fetch in the technical IDs. And you kind of might get a bit confused. What's the plan? I just see the technical ID. I have no idea what the plan is. So that's why when we massage the configuration a bit, what we do is we first of all bring in a data source that fetches the technical ID so that you clearly see, okay, I'm creating an instance of alert notification service with the plan name standard, and replace the technical ID with the corresponding reference. Now, in addition, we of course also bring in the explicit dependency to the entitlement that is needed for you in order to be able to read the plan. So that's also something that is done for you on your behalf. And yeah, let's now see if things are working. So let's do a Terraform plan, and let's store the planning result. No configuration file. Yeah, because I'm not in the right folder. That makes sense. Let me clear things up a bit. And now let's do it again. And now, of course, refreshing takes a bit longer because we have a bit more resources than we had before. But nevertheless, it will hopefully do its job. Keeping fingers crossed. Yeah, here we go. So we have 6 resources to import. That sounds good. So let's do the execution. Let's bring this. That's not what I wanted. Let's bring this to life and apply it. Gosh. That's live. So here we go. Or here we don't go. Let's try it again. And let's see, we called it Terraform import TF plan. Yeah, here we go. 6 resources imported. If we take a look at the state, everything is there that we expected. So we have the sub account, we have the 2 entitlements, we have the role collection, the service instance, and the subscription. And to show you that this really worked, let's do another Terraform plan to see if everything is imported correctly and there are no changes that are enforced. So refreshing. And no changes needed. Your infrastructure matches the configuration. So you have, or we have now, successfully imported a complete configuration with basically 2 commands from our CLI without looking into the cockpit, without using the BTP CLI to find out all the import information and so on. So I think that's quite a good experience from my perspective. Now let's take a look at the second flow, and I will now delete what we just did. And the second flow is the BTP TF export flow. So again, we have this command, we have several options and quite some examples on how to export things. There is one thing that I would like to highlight because that might be of interest for you. We have just seen now a, let's say, local import, and the state gets stored locally, but usually in a productive setup, you would probably have a backend configured. And if you tell us how we should integrate that in the provider configuration, either by a configuration file or by a manually handing in the configuration of the backend, we can directly inject that into our generated code. So again, nothing that you have to do here after the stuff got generated. And now let's see how this feels like or looks like exporting directly. So the command isn't that different. So what we have here is a BTP-TF export. Now we restrict it to the subscriptions and the sub account with respect to what we want to export for the sake of time. And we specify the sub account. So let's do that. So no difference here. We once again get our files created. It's creating our import blocks for the sub account. It's generating the Terraform configuration for the sub account. And now it's creating the subscription. And now let's abort it. Let's bring in some issue. Maybe there was a network issue. Maybe there was something not working on BTP for a temporal hiccup. Everything could happen, right? What to do now? We have now some kind of partial export. We have the sub account there. We probably have the configuration there. We have this temporary file with the subscription config. So it's already started to exporting the subscription, but that's not cool. What do we have to do now? Do we have to remove everything? Do we have to start from scratch, which is no fun if you have a huge sub account that you want to export? So that's why we thought it might be a good idea to have some kind of save points from where you can resume the processing. And if our CLI gets aware that there is a file and there is an import log existing, you can resume the existing export. Of course, you can overwrite everything, but we want to resume it. Now it tells us, okay, there is another directory where I would like to bring in the configuration. Should I overwrite it? Yes, that's a temporary file. Let's overwrite it. And the import now continues. So we have the sub-account subscription that we did not successfully import before. So now it's getting things done again by importing the missing bits and pieces that we want to import. And yeah, it's done. It imported all the two resources. It tells us that it imported all the two resources. And if we take a look at the code, it's exactly how it should look like. We have our two import files, we have our provider TF file, and we have the resources that are again, cleaned up and easier to use for you. And with that, let's switch back to the slides. So we have seen now how the Terraform exporter works, how it feels like, what you have to do, and what's taken over by the exporter. Now, there are some things that I would like to stress because this demo could be a bit misleading. So the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP is an export tool. Importing Terraform resources means that you have to know a decent knowledge about Terraform, how things work with Terraform, and what you have to take a look at if you get this code generated. So it's not like a casual user tool. The CLI, as we have seen, makes the import definitely easier. There is much less that you have to care about. And the Terraform code is already fine-tuned a bit, but be aware, we will not be able to deliver the perfect Terraform code that matches your organizational constraints and policies. As we've been said at the very beginning, you might have some governance policies in place, like naming conventions, like let's say other policies due to your industry-specific guidelines. And this is something that we cannot pre-think. This is something that you would have to do then once the Terraform configuration is generated. For example, like bringing in modules that you might have within your organization. Nevertheless, we know that we are not at the end yet with respect to improving this quality of the generated code. So we will definitely work on that. And we would love to hear from you what you think might make sense to also bring into the tool in this generic improvement of the Terraform configuration. Nevertheless, want to stress again, there is some manual work and refinement still needed on your end no matter how far we push the quality of the generated code. But I hope you agree that the CLI makes your life already quite much easier. And with that, let's shortly summarize what we have seen today. So first of all, what's an important message point that I want to stress is managing existing SAP BTP accounts via Terraform is possible. It's nothing that you have to live with if you started with manually setting up sub-accounts and now switching to Terraform. It's possible to bring in all the stuff under Terraform. And this is a functionality that the Terraform CLI per se offers out of the box. So this is nothing that we invented. That's something that comes due to this ecosystem, due to the experience that Terraform has. Now, this import functionality, as we have seen, is okay-ish. It works, but it's not fun. That's why we implemented the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP, which should tremendously improve your import experience, bringing stuff under the management of Terraform. Now we try to of course, improve this generated Terraform code, especially with respect to making it better and making all the cumbersome tasks of you less and less. So again, we highly appreciate your feedback on what could be improved there, what might make sense. Head over to the GitHub repository, file an issue with a feature request so that we can see where we can work on. This is now exactly the right time because we are now with the release candidate. We are trying to get things out of the door next month with respect to a GA version of the exporter. So if you have some input, feel free to drop it. And with that, we can jump over to the questions that might have been asked.
Yes, great. Thank you so much to both of you, Christian and Vipin, for your excellent presentation again. We have had, I have to say, a few questions in the chat, but Vipin was so kind to already answer them.
Okay, cool.
Which is absolutely great. But I would like to take the opportunity to ask, because, you know, we have the global user groups who are offering all these expert sessions. They come back to us often with questions, and one would be, is it also possible to export one SAP BTP global account or several sub-accounts in one run?
So as I said before, this is something that we intentionally do not support with the CLI. And the reason for that is because I think it is quite tempting for a customer to do this export in one run and have then everything under Terraform management, but then have a state file. And it's basically always that's the angle where we have to look at it. That is just huge. Now you might say, I don't care if it's huge. Well, you might care about it once you make changes to your configuration, because then think about the flow. So Terraform then has to really refresh the state before it does the change. And has to fetch all the information of all the sub-accounts. So let's assume you have 20 sub-accounts that you export with one run that land in this state file. Then even if you change just the configuration of one sub-account, you have to fetch or Terraform has to fetch the information from all the sub-accounts. So this will be then not the best experience and also leaves room for maybe unwanted side effects that you bring in. Of course, for those of you who really know Terraform well, there is a Terraform way how to target things. So you could kind of carve out what you want to do, but that's not a recommended practice. So that's why we decided to keep things separate, to have you do things for each sub-account separately, which from that angle makes sense, makes it a bit more work, but that's what it is.
Great, makes sense, yes, thank you. Then another question, are there restrictions with regards to the import on BTP in general?
Yeah, I shortly mentioned that. There are, of course, resources that are not importable. if you take a look at the Terraform provider documentation or the Cloud Foundry provider documentation, as I said, we also support import of Cloud Foundry orgs and what's underneath. There are resources that we simply cannot import because the platform API doesn't allow us to read the information. So there might be some resources that are currently temporarily not available for import, or that are simply not supported for import, and that we then can also not kind of bring into the Terraform exporter and help you there.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, one important question is, if people, attendees or people watching the video afterwards have any questions or require support, where can they turn to?
So the easiest way, and maybe I share again the screen
maybe Vipin, if you have the link, you can share the link in the chat. That would be awesome.
Yeah, so as we said, the Terraform exporter for SAP BTP is an open source project. In consequence, it's under the SAP organization on GitHub as a public repository. And depending on what you want to discuss or what you want to achieve, you have two options. If you find a bug, if you want a feature request, just jump over to the issues and create a new issue. We have templates for bugs, for feature requests. That's something that should help you with that regard. Now, if you have more kind of an idea or want to discuss it with us, we also have GitHub discussions enabled. So this is kind of a forum that you can use and where you can interact with us. Now, you don't need to shy back from that, thinking about, okay, if I do the discussion, then you tell me that's a feature request, I have to open an issue. No worries. If the discussion ends up to be a feature request, we can directly transfer the discussion into feature request or a bug. No work for you. So if you start here, nothing gets lost. And that would be the preferred way and the most scalable way how to interact with us with respect to the Terraform exporter.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vipin, also for posting the links in the chat. So, Kurt, we don't have any questions left over. I would like to offer again, if any questions pop up, first of all, you now have the links, but any other related questions in the comments area underneath this video. And of course, at the best time, sooner or later, I will include the link in the description to of this video to the presentation of today. And with this, again, a big thank you to Christian and Vipin for your.
I think you're on mute now.
Hear me again?
Yep, now we can hear.
Seems my headset decided it doesn't want to work anymore. Too much work. So, Beezer, welcome. Thank you for joining. He was working, just an explanation. He was in the back in case there were any questions for process automation. Beezer will be the speaker in April for the majority of the sessions, if not all sessions. And with this, big thank you to all attendees for joining. And look forward to see you again in the next weeks. Have a great day. Have a great evening, depending on where you are.
Bye.
Bye.